Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Florida Anon here, full-time guide by trade. I work backwoods, swamps, pine scrub forests, freshwater and saltwater for trophy game hunting, fishing. Specifically work untouched and unpressured areas. Have seen and experienced a lot of weird and terrifying things over the years, and heard more than a few stories from other guides. As you can tell, I can't greentext, so I won't even try. Kick back, grab a snack and get ready for a wall of text. Old heads in the outdoors industries around here don't like people talking about things that happen, for fear of scaring off business and tourists that they depend on for a living. Didn't fully understand until recently just how far up the ladder that suppression of information goes. The state of Florida, FWC aka the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and other land management/outdoor-oriented entities are, and have been for decades, pushing things under the rug so as not to reduce Florida outdoors tourism. Due to this, I feel like it's time someone started telling people about some of the things going on down here. I could give a shit if you believe me or not. A lot of what I have to tell are my own stories, and I'll share them as well as I can remember them. But it's hard to describe things that not only don't make logical sense and happened quickly during what were, at the time, extremely terrifying moments. The other stories will be secondhand accounts from other guides that want to get their stories out. A lot of these stories came out after copious amounts of alcohol, so I'll fill in the gaps as best I can, so that they will make sense to the general public. First off, I doubt many people outside of people in the outdoor guiding communities of Florida have ever heard of them, but the Drass are some ass-puckeringly terrifying primordial entities that have been around since the first recorded history of people that made their way into Florida. Best way I can describe them is as nature guardians. From what I've learned, there are a bunch of them, and they all have their own territories that they protect. They're all unique in their own ways, not just in how they look but also how they act and respond to people in their territory. They also have their own ways of being appeased and their own sets of rules. The general idea of keeping them happy and respecting the nature in their territories is a good way to keep them away from you. There's the amalgamation that looks like a giant lump of dead animals all smashed together in a moving pile. I'm pretty sure that one sole goal is to scare away anyone that makes its way into its territory. Because if the giant mass of moaning and screeching flesh doesn't send you running away with bricks dropping out of your pant legs, then the smell will definitely drive you off. Well, I guess I'll keep telling you guys about the Drass that I've had an encounter with. First-hand information first to give you guys a good feel for them before I try and tell you other people's stories. This particular Drass likes to roam a portion of what's called the Econlockhatchee River system. It's a tributary of the St. Johns River and runs through the heart of central Florida. It's said that all the development on its land has pushed it back farther into the river system, and that may be why it's so messed up, but honestly, who knows? We don't understand much about these things, and this one really doesn't give a shit about us. I was making my way through the river system, scouting potential fishing spots for a client that was looking to bag some big trophy fish in untouched waters when I had my encounter with it. I'll never forget the smell. That was the first thing I noticed. It was the smell of swamp rot, stagnant water, and decay. Much like the smell you get when you step into an untouched mud puddle in the middle of a swamp. I was making my way through some game trails in relatively high and dry grounds, near what I knew to be a productive fishing area when I got hit with that smell. The fact that it was so out of place for that area made my hair stand on end, and an immediate feeling of wrongness washed over me. I've seen and dealt with more than my fair share of hostile animals and people in the wilderness, and have learned how to keep my cool, even when I feel like I'm about to die. This feeling flushed all that right down the drain. I immediately broke one of the most important rules in outdoor guiding. I blindly hauled ass into the brush like a scared kid. I remember almost immediately losing track of where I was and almost any sense of direction, despite knowing this whole area like the back of my hand. It was like the entire forest had turned against me. Every time I slowed down, the smell would get stronger, almost like it was following me, and if I slowed down, it would try to overtake me. It was enough to keep me running until I felt like my lungs were about to burst. No matter what I did, said, or tried to do, the damn forest kept getting more and more unfamiliar until I was forced to stop and try to survey my surroundings. I almost shit a full brick wall in my pants when I saw that I had stopped not a few dozen feet from where I had initially been hit with the smell. I was running in circles. There's a sense of terror that washes over you when you know that not even the gun on your hip will help with whatever the hell is happening. And let me tell you, it's not a feeling I ever want to experience again. After taking a minute and choking on the smell, I finally managed to find the game trail I had taken in and forced myself to slowly walk it back out, not running, despite what the lizard part of my brain was screaming. It wasn't until I'd made it back out into a relatively open clearing that ran back to the main river that the smell finally went away. I took stock of myself, covered in cold sweat, piss still barely in my bladder, and thankfully clean underwear. Then I took a look back at where I had come from. The only way I can describe it won't do it justice. This thing was easily 9 feet tall, gangly and covered in rotting swamp vegetation, almost humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong and stretched with absurdly long limbs and neck, and where the head should have been, there was a tangle of at least a dozen deer antler sheds. It was just tucked slightly behind a tree, staring at me with a gaze that oozed hatred, even though I couldn't see eyes of any kind. I know it's not much, but it's hard to describe a terrifying situation in detail when your main focus at the time was staying alive and keeping your shorts from overflowing with shit. Another one in the vein of cryptos-like things that Florida has is the mimics. I've seen a lot of talk about skinwalkers and such on here, but as far as I know and have heard, there have been no verified skinwalker encounters this far south. A lot of creatures, or the things that they do, end up being labeled a skinwalker encounter on here, but I have a feeling that they are something entirely different. The mimics are one such thing. Simply put, they're unidentified voices in the woods. They can sound like a recording stuck on a loop, the same tone, inflection, and varying volumes on repeat, or they can sound like your voice repeating things back to you. I've only heard of one time that the voices ever seemed anything close to sentient in the sense that they tried to form a sentence out of an abundance of voices it probably heard, and wasn't just a direct repeat of a sentence someone had said. They're known to try and lure people deep into the woods or into dangerous areas. For what? I have no clue, and as far as I know, no one has ever seen what makes the voices or why they do it, past causing harm. I'm not saying that there's no person to ever see where the voices come from, but if they have, they never made it back to tell anyone.
Grew up in rural North Carolina. I remember the mimics as a kid. I heard the voices at least a dozen times on different occasions. Usually sounded like a family member calling. Usually it sounded like my grandma calling my name. It would come from the woods, but even as a dipshit kid, I figured my grandma would be in the house, so I'd go back to see what she wanted. She'd be sitting in the living room or kitchen. I'd ask if she called for me. Nope, never did. Something out there in the woods had heard my name and wanted me to go in. It was all old growth at the time, untouched, ancient Appalachian forest. Not the nice green-laden forest floor you're used to seeing in national parks. Mostly just barren, detritus-ridden openings between branches, trunks of aging pine, littered with fallen trees and branches. Those woods never seemed friendly. I took the trails in as I got older, but more and more you would feel a presence as you got deeper in. Didn't feel it on any other trails or in other patches of wood. It was specific to that forest.
Another distinctly terrifying thing in Florida is the Everglades plane graveyards. There have been many a plane crash in the Glades, and while some of them are easily verified and explainable, there are more than a few that have gone unreported and unexplained. The phenomenon around the crashes that is really scary involves how these downed planes seem to pop up and then disappear throughout the Glades. You're always told never to use downed planes as landmarks when you're navigating the Glades due to how frequently they pop up and then disappear, and also seem to move of their own volition. I was once told by an old-timer that if I ever came across more than one downed plane in a half-mile area, to immediately turn around and not come back for a couple of weeks. The superstition is that the plane graveyards are a marker to an area that is a kind of soft spot between places in time and space. A spot where things go in, but never come back out, or if they do, it's not the same as how they went or when they went in. An old story passed around by guides is how a man was searching for a gator fishing area, only to stumble across one of these plane graveyards, only to be warded off by another boat. After describing the boat and planes to an FWC officer, due to how freaked out he was by the whole situation, he was informed that what he saw was impossible because the boat and man he was talking about were declared missing and legally dead over 20 years prior.
I wouldn't be surprised since Florida is part of a ley line area. Alternate timeline or interdimensional portals or vortices most probably appear from time to time. Might also be where the Drass may travel from and to.
Sorry for the delay. Back with more. Was talking with the other guide who was scouting spots with me yesterday, and he brought up a good one that you guys have mentioned here and there in this thread. Skunk apes. His only encounter with one was a doozy from the sounds of it. He heard reports of something tearing down stands and feeders on a hunting plot that he leased out with a few other guides, and no one could seem to figure out what was doing it. The rest of the guides were lazy and didn't spend as much time on the property as he did, and blamed it on local shitheads tearing up property for fun. Taking it upon himself, he decided to stake out the hunting plots for a weekend, spending a night at each of the 3 stands and seeing if he could spot who was destroying their plots. The first 2 nights were uneventful, but on the 3rd morning, he found that one of the stands he had staked out previously had been fucked with. One of the ladders that was lag-bolted to the tree had its bottom section ripped free and tossed a few dozen feet away into a small pile of brush, along with the feeder being tipped over. Deciding to take a chance, and assuming that someone was watching him cycle through the stands, he stayed in the same one he had the night before, hoping that they figured he'd moved on. He said that his blood pretty much froze when he saw the animal eye reflection, about 7 feet up in the air and peeking around the edge of a bunch of trees near the end of the shooting lane they had cut out. The one thing that he vividly remembers is how tall it was, how wide it was, and the fact that it made sure it made eye contact with him before sliding back into the trees. This is a guy who is trained to listen for and spot animals, and he said that thing was dead silent in its movements, and while it may have not been the 9-foot-tall Bigfoot described by most people up north, it was easily 7 foot tall and wider in then shoulders than any man he had met. Never mentioned anything about it being hairy or any fur color, and it's probably due to seeing it in the weird twilight that dawn brings, but he said that it definitely didn't have the silhouette of a normal person. The smell also faded quickly after he saw it slip back into the trees. He refuses to hunt there anymore, but he's never heard any more reports of it showing back up. The one thing that really freaked me out in his story was just how quiet this thing was. The fact that it could sneak up on him while being that big is more than concerning for me. Bears and the like make enough noise that you know they're coming, and panthers are about the only things that move silently enough to go undetected and are relatively large, but this thing apparently didn't make a sound. Let's get out of the woods for a bit, though. I don't mind going back to them if you guys want more, but there's a whole lot more to talk about with the amount of water and coastlines we have. I've heard more than a few reports of ghost ships popping up and subsequently disappearing after not responding to hails, and being sighted offshore or popping up on radar, but not being there when a rescue ship finally makes it to the last known location. The only one I've personally happened upon in that vein, while maybe not overtly supernatural, was enough to make me ditch the boat after tossing in an EPIRB emergency beacon for the Coast Guard to track down. We were running about 25 miles off the east coast chasing kingfish when we heard a call go out across VHF Channel 16 for a boat in distress. We heard the initial hail for Mayday, but the person sending out the call was doing it to report an empty vessel floating away from a well-known spot for reef fishing. We were nearby. Some decided to swing by and see if there was still a need for help, due to not seeing many people out on the water that day. I've seen boats drift off anchor while someone is diving and leave them stranded, and other similar events, so we figured it wouldn't be something critical unless someone was injured and had fallen overboard. We hailed the person sending out the Mayday call for the other vessel, and they said that they were the only 2 vessels in the area, and he hadn't seen anyone in the water, or bubbles rising like someone was down below scuba diving. Weird, but still nothing creepy. We managed to find the boat not far off the spot that the original call said it would be, and that's when everything started to look weird. First, the anchor was still securely stowed on the front of the boat, so there was no sign of it drifting off anchor or snapping an anchor line. What really set our hair on end was the signs that it had been adrift for a while. The bait on the deck was hard and crusty. The live well was off, and the fish still in it were obviously bloated and rotted from stewing in hot, stagnant salt water, and the key was in the on position, but it had no power across the console, and the motor obviously wasn't running. This thing had been left in the on and ready position when it had been abandoned, making us think we had a man overboard scenario that was a couple of days old at the least. Calling it in with the Coast Guard, we relayed the registration numbers to them and asked if they had any reports of it being missing. I swear the lady on the other end of the line sounded like she was about to shit when she replied. The boat had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier in the Keys, and we found it just off the coast near Ponce Inlet, about 400 miles away up the coast. That part wasn't so weird. Due to the current flow up the coast, it was natural for it to head that way. What really set us off was the fact that it had disappeared on a sunny, flat day, and we had a swell over 2 feet during the time it was missing. Short of these guys abandoning ship, there was no reason for the boat to be in pristine condition but unmanned. We had heard reports of pirates seizing boats and then tossing victims overboard after taking what they wanted. What they did next was really screwed up. They would call in the vessels across main radio channels, luring people like us out to them and then doing the same thing with our boat. It was about the time that we received the report back from the Coast Guard lady that it all clicked with us. We hadn't seen the other boat that had initially called it in, and we weren't sticking around to find out who it was. We popped a blinking EPIRB in that boat and hauled ass back to shore. We heard later that they had hauled the boat back in, but there were no signs of foul play, and it was chalked up to a freak accident of some kind. The 2 guys that had been in the boat were never found, and as far as I know, nothing was missing off of it, but it was enough to set our spook radar on high alert and get us to bug out.
Holy shit, that is far.
East of Naples, Florida, on the edge of the Everglades, is a large, partially developed residential area called Golden Gate Estates, originally a Florida land scheme run by the Rosen family in the 1960s. Some of the area has been developed while the rest consists of miles and miles of streets with few or no houses. The portion south of Alligator Alley was purchased by the state of Florida and is being restored to its natural state. Residents of the area are frequently visited by bears, bobcats, deer, hogs, and even panthers. According to local legends, somewhere in this vast area lives a group of people called the Squallies. They are said to be short, human-like creatures with a pig-like snout, also called Squally Kids due to their short stature. According to most accounts, they are a community of 30 to 50 adults. There are several stories as to their origins. Some claim that they were produced from a government genetics experiment gone wrong. There are stories about an abandoned laboratory somewhere near DeSoto Boulevard and Oil Well Road where they were created. Others claim that they are simply a family of highly inbred humans who live in the vast Everglades. According to some of the legends, they live in a place called the Neithlorendum Sanctuary. Allegedly, the sanctuary is guarded by a crazy old man who will shoot trespassers on sight. It is unclear if he is a security guard or if he is actually the scientist who created the Squallies. All agree that the Squallies will try to capture any humans who enter their sanctuary and eat them alive.
Something saved my life on Cocoa Beach, Florida on Easter Sunday, 1994, and no human stepped forward and claimed to be it. Something brought me in from the water, and seemingly no one else even saw any of the incident. It was actually a school trip, coming from Kentucky and headed to a 3-day sea camp on Big Pine Key. Roughly halfway between is Cocoa Beach, Florida, which was where we stopped the first night and spent the next day, Easter, playing on the beach before continuing our journey, by school bus, to the Keys. I was 14, and this would be my first time ever seeing a body of water large enough that it ended on the horizon. So there we were, a bunch of teenagers, about 15 of us on the trip, walking out into the ocean and jumping the waves. It was fun, but I wasn't used to it. I'd only played in creeks at this point in my life, and they don't have waves. When you do find a swimming hole in a creek, the first goal is to walk out as far as you can until your head doesn't go under. From there, playing is just a series of swimming back and forth to the spot where your feet could still touch. With all my classmates stopping at waist deep to play in this ocean, I thought I would impress them by walking out further. I started walking. I had to stay focused to keep my footing when the waves would come, but I was determined to make it until the water touched my chin while my feet touched the ground. And I did. Sure, it only hit both spots in between waves, but I was pretty sure I'd made it that far. I turned to make sure my friends could see me and be impressed, expecting to find a line of them following me, but no one was behind me. My friends were the size of ants, still back at waist-deep water, and no one seemed to notice how far out I had gone. I panicked. I started to walk back, but my feet couldn't find the ground. I was trying to swim, but the waves kept coming, and the harder I tried, the further I went. I was trying to scream, "Help!" But every time my head was out of the water and I opened my mouth, all I got out was, "Huh," and then another wave would cover me and fill my mouth and drag me further out and under. I never even got to scream for help one whole time. The next thing I remember is feeling an arm around my body and the rush of the water against me as I'm being swam to shore. I believe I was in and out of consciousness during this time because the memory is flashy. I remember a glimpse of blonde hair in the water, but I had blonde hair, so it could have been mine. However, something also made me feel like this was a female whose arm was around me. Next, I remember being dropped face down onto the sand, and immediately I began vomiting up tons of water. Once I stopped vomiting and realized I could and was breathing air, I turned to thank whoever this was. There was no one. Nobody was there to see if I was going to stop puking up ocean water and breathe through my lungs. The beachgoers around the area weren't even looking at me. Nobody was coming to check my vitals. The teachers and other students were further down the beach, and none of them even looked my way. I made it back to my crowd and decided I wouldn't say anything. I was a little embarrassed, and I also had a fear that if the teachers found out I'd almost drowned, they would call my mom and she would demand I come home, and the whole trip would be scrapped. So I said nothing, and no one ever said anything to me.
This encounter happened when I was 15 years old, back in 1993. We had just moved to an area called Wekiva Springs, Florida, and our house was built brand new and was on the edge of Wekiva Springs State Park. It was still wild enough at that time that we could only take the trash out 30 minutes before the truck came, due to the black bears that still ventured into the neighborhood. The deer population is off the charts, and to this day you will see dozens throughout the day randomly in the neighborhood. Wild turkeys, wild pigs, bobcats, you name it. Our home sat perfectly on the one lake in the area, and as I said just months prior, the lot was just woods. At that time, we did not have any neighbors or houses to our left or right, although the front of the neighborhood had been built out 20 years prior. I became very familiar with the square mile around my home and grew quite comfortable venturing out there sometimes, returning at dusk. One day, while going to check on my failed project of growing a marijuana plant, I saw my younger brother, who was 11, exiting the patio door about 50 yards behind me. I wasn't entering the woods yet, but saw he was trying to sneak and follow me back there. I decided to play along and acted like I didn't know he was following. As I was walking, I would hear him occasionally behind me, and I would stop suddenly, just to make sure. As I got deeper into the woods, I noticed it was much calmer than normal. Keep in mind, I had been going back here 5 times a week for a couple of months at this point. There was not much else to do. I didn't see any deer or squirrels, and in hindsight, there weren't even any wind or birds. I remember this well because I could hear my brother surprisingly well, almost too much so. I thought it would be funny if I turned the prank around on him and hid behind a tree and jumped out and scared him when he passed by. It had been about 5 minutes of walking back, and we were deep enough in to really scare him. I found my tree, stopped all movement, and waited. I figure he was only 45 seconds or so behind. As I waited, I realized now there was no sound, almost as if I had earplugs in, but this meant nothing to me at the time other than observation. I heard my brother getting close and didn't realize how loud he was.
He must be only 20 feet back around the turn any second I will see him, except I never did. The footsteps suddenly stopped, and now I was in the weird position of just sitting there behind the tree. 2 minutes passed, and now I was getting curious and wondered what had happened to him. Or did he just realize what I was doing and was going to scare me? I finally decided to take a look. I went around the corner and could see back a good way and saw nothing. This was impossible because I had heard him following me the whole time and didn't hear anything after I got behind the tree, which meant he literally disappeared. The woods were now suddenly creepy, and I got a very anxious feeling for the first time ever that day. My head said to go home now, but for some reason, I couldn't seem to get my bearings. I literally was lost. I calmed down and figured out the way back on the trail even though I never left it. It was like my equilibrium was off. At this point, my younger brother was nowhere to be seen, and I was genuinely concerned considering he was just feet behind me a few minutes prior. I was yelling his name and started jogging back towards the direction of my home. After a couple of minutes, I finally heard his voice. He was hiding under some palmetto leaves that he had laid across his body off the side of the trail, just lying on the ground. I didn't know what to think, but I said, "Get up right now," and still have the weird feeling that I've had for the last 5 minutes. He got up and I asked him what was happening and what was going on. He just said, "Please, just run. Run to the house with me." I didn't ask questions and ran back with him. Once we got to the backyard, he said that he had been following me, when all of a sudden he smelled something horrible and looked to his left and said he saw a big hairy person thing. What was it, a cop? What do you mean? He repeated that it was a big person with hair all over them, and it scared him so badly that he just fell to the ground and rolled into the palmetto bushes and just sat there frozen until I found him. At that moment we heard a loud bang, 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 and a weird scream from the woods behind us. We both looked, and sure enough, hanging from a tree about 50 yards behind us and swinging from a large branch was the thing he was talking about. If I didn't know better, it looked like a human being mimicking a large monkey swinging from a branch. It just made no sense and was completely out of place. Clear as day, this was a large, burly thing that looked more like a person than anything else. We both sat there not knowing what to do. The thing swung off the branch into the woods and was out of sight but was hollering the whole time. We immediately ran all the way to the house yelling for Mom and Dad to tell them what we saw. At first we got the whole, "Oh, it was just a bear. It was a bear." But eventually, later that night, I think they realized we were serious, and the next day my dad was able to find a report that in Florida there were encounters with something called a skunk ape. Over the next 5 years, I would continue to have run-ins with this thing, and 2 times we had a deer leg and skull put in our backyard. Once I had turkey feathers put on my windowsill. I didn't know anything about what that meant, and only later, as I researched the subject, did I learn about that. Every 6 months or so, the park rangers would have to come to our home and put a barrel in our yard with a donut to capture the black bears that were too comfortable coming to the neighborhood. After seeing the same ranger for the 3rd time, I felt comfortable enough to ask him what he did with the bears once he got them. He just said that they moved them to deeper parts of the park or altogether relocate them in extreme cases, and then said, "But that's not what you need to worry about." I asked him what he meant, and he just said there were things bigger and worse than bears out in the woods and to always be careful. I remember that to this day and kind of understand what he meant after having had that experience and knowing that there was indeed something else out in those woods behind my home. Today, my parents still live in that same home, and I go visit from time to time. My dad, being retired, has nothing but time, and he's actually grown to be a believer himself, and over the years has a few experiences of his own, including orbs. The house is about 15 minutes from downtown Orlando, but in an area that is surprisingly untouched by humans. As I said, it's a protected state park, and the home is right on the edge of where the park begins. I think when the home was built, we disturbed probably where this thing was staying or its general area, and then its more homes were built. It got pushed further back, but at that time was still coming in fairly close. It's not a crazy, insane encounter or dangerous or thrilling, but nonetheless, it was real. I saw it with my own eyes and then had follow-up experiences. So now I'm just trying to learn all about these things.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily, A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.